Want to learn how to make a simple leaf pouch for your elf or fairy? Here's a tutorial using my digital pattern, which you can download and print at home. To make this pouch, I will be using a number 11 X-acto knife, a pencil, an edge beveler, a scratch awl, a freehand groover, some drive punches, a mallet, an edge slicker, blunt needles, and some scissors, also a lighter. For dyeing, I'll be using a piece of sheepskin, but you can use a regular sponge. For materials, I'll be using some 7 to 8 ounce veg tan, some 3 to 4 ounce soft leather, some leather lace, waxed thread, and some EcoFlow water-based dye. Start by printing out your pattern and cutting out the shapes. Align the two A's with each other and tape these pieces together. I would recommend using a punch and a sharp knife to cut out the larger holes. Now that the pattern's ready, let's start with the leaf flap. Place your pattern on the leather you've chosen for the leaf. Trace it, then carefully cut it out with your knife. Use the edge beveler to trim the edges on the top grain. Then do the same on the suede side. I also recommend using a knife to cut off the points. Now you can mark the holes of the belt slide using a pencil, then the other holes using a scratch awl. You can also use the awl to make the stitching holes, or use a drive punch or a single hole chisel. For the belt slides, use a drive punch to punch a hole at either end, then carefully use a knife to cut between the two holes. I recommend starting the cuts from the edge of the hole, cutting to somewhere in the middle, then turn the piece around, start on the opposite hole, and meet the first cut in the center. Otherwise, you might accidentally cut past your hole, which you don't want. Use the edge beveler to cut around the belt slides on the top grain and suede side. I like to add veins to my leaves using a freehand grooving tool. You can trace the veins you want with a pencil, then follow the lines with a groover. You could also use a swivel knife or a pyrography tool for this. While we still have out our thicker leather, go ahead and trace and cut out the toggle. You could also make the toggle out of a piece of wood or antler, or use a large button. Use the edge beveler to round out the edges, and then punch out the two holes. Next, let's finish up cutting out our pieces on the soft leather. Trace one of the large rectangle and 2 of the pouch sides. You can use a knife or scissors to cut out these pieces. If you're liking this video so far, consider giving that like button a tickle, and maybe even subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, or you can even share this video if you really want to be nice. Now mark the holes using an awl. It's very important that you punch the holes exactly as they are marked because they match between the different pieces. You can then use a scratch awl or a chisel to punch out these holes. I wouldn't recommend using a small hole punch for the soft leather. Then you just need to punch out the 4 holes on the front, and all your pieces are now ready. But before we sew them together, we have to dye our leaf. Start by putting something under your leaf and dye to protect your work surface. Get some dye onto the sponge and apply in circular motions over the piece. If you want to have a mottled, more natural effect, do a second pass where you simply pat the sponge on the surface and allow the dye to soak in completely. Apply the dye to the edges and optionally to the suede side. If you don't want to get dye on the suede, you can use painter's tape to protect it. To finish up the dyeing process, I apply a coat of my homemade leather balm and use an edge slicker to burnish the edges. Don't forget to burnish inside the belt slide as well. You may also want to apply an acrylic sealer. You could leave the toggle its natural color and simply apply some balm and burnish the edge, or dye it green or brown. It's up to you. Now it's time for sewing. Let's start by sewing the toggle onto the leaf tip. You can sew this part with a single needle, starting on the suede side and looping up and around through the 2 sets of holes several times. Don't sew too tightly so that the lace can still fit around the toggle. After sewing around 2 or 3 times, tie a knot on the back against the suede side and cut the threads about 1 centimeter away from the knot. Then, use a lighter to burn the ends down like a candle and smush the melted wax, forming a glob that glues the knot in place. Next, we'll sew the leaf flap to the pouch back. Make your thread about 3 times the length of the seam, plus an extra 6 inches or so for attaching your needles. Attach a needle at each end of the thread by sewing back through the end of the thread, then sewing again through the thread that passes through. We'll be sewing using a saddle stitch. Start by lining up the first holes and sewing through them both. Then, sew through the second holes with one needle and back through them from the other side with the other needle. Make sure your thread is even on both sides and continue sewing through each set of holes with both needles. At the end of the seam, you can sew back 1 stitch but come out the side in between the 2 pieces of leather. Tie your threads in a knot. Cut about 1 centimeter away. Burn it down and smush between the layers like a sandwich. Now we can sew on the sides. I like to use a stitch that looks like little X's, so we need about 4.5 times the length of the seam, plus about 6 inches extra to attach the needles. I would cut out both of your lengths of thread for each side at this stage to save yourself a headache later. To start this stitch, we sew through the back of the first 2 holes. Then, take 1 needle and sew through the next hole down on the opposite side, and come back up at a diagonal through the hole 2 down from the first on the original side. Do the same with the other needle in reverse. Continue sewing these little X's all the way around. For the last 2 holes, you can sew back inside with both needles, and then you can tie your knot inside the pouch. Cut about 1 centimeter away, burn the knot down, and smush. Now you can take your second piece of thread and sew the other side in the same manner. If you ever have a hard time getting your needle through the suede side, try using the other needle to poke from the top grain side to try to unjam the suede inside the hole. Now all that's left to do is attach the lace. Thread the lace through one of the bottom holes on the pouch body, then the top, then back down through the other side. You may want to also tie knots at the bottom. And there you have it, a nice little pouch perfect for your resident forest elf or fairy. If you liked this tutorial, you might consider supporting me through Patreon, where I share daily behind-the-scenes videos, monthly video lessons, and a free download of the pattern to go with these tutorials. Thanks for watching, and happy crafting!